told you that being, you know, a diehard Taylor Swift fan or painting your face in your team's colors for a freezing Sunday football game
Mhm.
utilizes the exact same sociological mechanics as ancient religious rituals.
Oh, absolutely. It's the same machinery.
Right. I mean, think about it. You've got the sacred chants, the designated holy spaces like the stadium or the arena, the shared emotional highs and lows, and this profound feeling of belonging to a tribe that is just much larger than yourself.
Exactly.
Because usually when we think of religion, we picture something rigid, a building with a steeple, a holy book, a person in robes. We tend to treat society like a clean map where we can draw a hard border and say, the religion happens over here in this building and the secular world happens everywhere else.
Yeah, we crave that kind of categorization. It's a very comfortable, very Western way of organizing human experience into binary boxes.
Yeah.
The sacred on one side, the profane on the other. Church over here, state over there.
But the moment you step out into the actual modern globalized world, that neat little map completely disintegrates. We are currently looking at a spiritual landscape that is profoundly murky, boundary defying, and honestly incredibly vibrant.
It really is.
So welcome to this deep dive where you and I are going to try and navigate those exact waters. Our guide for this journey is an absolute monolith of a source text. It's the Oxford Handbook of the Sociology of Religion, edited by Peter B. Clarke.
It's massive.
Yeah, we are talking about a collection that brings together over 50 leading scholars, and the mission of this deep dive is to completely reframe how you think about faith, belief, and meaning today. We're moving away from that old, rigid idea of religion as just going to church, and we are going to explore a new, global, organic understanding of religion.
Yeah.
An understanding that touches literally everything, from the internet and human rights to ecology and, the physical movements of our own bodies.
And I think it's important to note right up front that this handbook represents a fundamental paradigm shift in the discipline of sociology itself. Historically, as Peter B. Clarke outlines in the introduction, the sociology of religion was heavily compromised by Western notions, ideas derived almost exclusively from the study of Christianity.
Oh, for sure.
And that narrow focus created an impression of religion as something fixed, static, and primarily concerned with formal institutions and written doctrine. What this handbook argues, and what we're going to unpack today, is that we desperately need a cross-culturally relevant understanding, an organic concept that accounts for the fact that religion is a living, breathing, adapting phenomenon. It shapeshifts.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand where religion is going globally, to really grasp this organic model you're talking about, we first have to understand the lens through which sociologists have historically viewed it, and why that historical lens is currently cracking under the pressure of modern reality.
Yeah, we have to look at the giants.
Right, the giants whose shoulders the entire discipline stands on. Emile Durkheim, Max Weber, and Karl Marx. Let's start with Durkheim, because his take always blew my mind. He wasn't really concerned with theology in the traditional sense or, trying to prove or disprove the existence of God. He was looking at what religion actually does.
Right. Durkheim, writing in the early 20th century, specifically in his seminal work, The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, did something completely revolutionary. He effectively bracketed the question of ultimate referential reality.
Meaning he just set it aside.
Exactly. In an era where rationalists were eagerly dismissing religious forces as mere illusions or primitive superstitions, Durkheim argued that the sacred is actually a very real marker of shared social identity. It's the glue.
So his argument is that when a group of people gather and hold something as sacred, whether that's a totem pole, a piece of bread, or a specific chanted prayer, they aren't just engaging with the divine. They are essentially worshiping the group itself.
Yes, they're reifying their own social bonds. Religion is society recognizing and celebrating itself in a mirror.
That is the classical Durkheimian view, and it was groundbreaking. But what's truly fascinating in the handbook, particularly in William E. Papen's chapter, is how this century-old sociological theory is suddenly finding incredible alignment with modern evolutionary biology.
So cognitive science.
Right. But I am struggling to see how tribal survival mechanisms on the prehistoric savanna connect to taking communion on a Sunday morning. How does sociology from 1912 link up with evolutionary biology today?
Well, it comes down to the evolution of human sociality. Evolutionary biologists and cognitive scientists, Peyton references scholars like Richard Sosis and Candace Alcorta, are starting to view religious behavior as a highly effective evolutionary mechanism for group solidarity.
Okay.
Think about early human groups trying to survive in a really hostile environment. They needed to trust each other completely to cooperate, hunt, share resources.
Mm.
But trust is risky. How do you know someone isn't going to cheat the group?
You look for costly signals. You look for shared markers.
Precisely. By engaging in shared, often highly demanding rituals, and by designating certain objects or spaces as inviolably sacred, early human groups created an ironclad, shared symbolic environment.
So if you were willing to go through, like, the painful initiation rite or adhere to the strict dietary taboo, you proved your commitment to the tribe.
Exactly. Groups that utilize these shared symbolic markers of the sacred could trust each other, cooperate, and ultimately survive much better than groups that lack that cohesive glue.
Wow. So the concept of the sacred isn't just some abstract cultural invention that we stumbled into. It's almost a biological imperative for a highly social species. That shared identity, brokered through the sacred, is literally what kept us alive against predators and competitors.
That is the emerging synthesis in the field, yeah.
Yeah.
Durkheim's idea that the objective world is constructed through collective representations fits perfectly with the idea that our brains evolved to use symbolic markers to build cohesive, resilient societies. Religion, at its evolutionary core, is an adaptive survival strategy.
That reframes so much. Okay, so if Durkheim gives us the evolutionary glue of society, what about Max Weber? Because he's the theorist most people know for linking religion directly to modern capitalism.
Right. Weber's most famous thesis is found in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. He essentially argued that the asceticism of Protestantism, specifically the Calvinist idea of working incredibly hard, living simply without luxury, and viewing your worldly, everyday profession as a divine calling, unintentionally laid the psychological and cultural groundwork for capitalism.
Basically, you work hard to prove you were saved by God, but you aren't allowed to spend the money on frivolous things, so you reinvest it. Boom, capitalism.
Yeah, the relentless accumulation of wealth.
But the handbook pushes back on this, or at least how we use it, right?
It does. It highlights a major blind spot in how sociology has historically utilized Weber. We often use his theories to tell a very triumphant Western story of secularization and modernization. The narrative goes that Protestantism created a rationalized worldview, which eventually made God unnecessary, leading to the modern secular capitalist West.
Right.
But Weber also wrote extensively on Islam and Confucianism. And the Handbook, particularly Brian S. Turner's analysis, demonstrates that the sacred-profane dynamic operates fundamentally differently in those traditions. You just cannot copy-paste the Protestant European experience onto the rest of the globe.
Let's break that down, because in the West, we have this deeply ingrained idea of the separation of church and state. It feels natural to us.
It feels natural because it is baked into Christian history. There's a long tradition of the church acting as an institution conceptually separate from the temporal power of the state. You know, the classic, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's.
Yeah, which allowed for a specific type of secularization to occur over centuries, a gradual decoupling of religious authority from political authority.
Exactly. But in Islam, as Turner notes, the core theological premise is different. The Quran affirms a divine law, Sharia, which is designed to encompass all aspects of human life. It doesn't draw a hard line between the political, the economic, and the spiritual.
So trying to force a Western model of secularization where religion just politely retreats into the private sphere of the home doesn't make sense in a framework where the ideal community and everyday public life are meant to be governed by the same divine principles.
Right. And what about Confucianism? It throws another wrench into the Western sociological model.
Oh.
It is often described more as a comprehensive system of ethical and social philosophy grounded in filial piety, ancestor reverence, and social harmony.
So it's not a prophetic, revelation-based, monotheistic religion in the same vein as Christianity or Islam.
No, it isn't. The Weberian model of secularization assumes a specific inherent tension between a perfect transcendent God and a corrupt, fallen material world. But Confucianism doesn't operate on that specific tension. So the theoretical lens simply cracks when applied to the East.
Which brings us to the third of the big three classical founders, Karl Marx, famously known for calling religion the opium of the people.
Yes. For Marx, religion was an ideology functioning to mask the harsh material realities of economic exploitation. He viewed it as a symptom of a profoundly sick, unequal society.
It provided a kind of illusory, narcotic happiness, right? The promise of a reward in the afterlife, so that the working class wouldn't rise up and revolt against the terrible material conditions of their actual lives.
Exactly. It's a cynical view, but a massively influential one.
However, reading through the handbook, you really get the distinct sense that modern sociology has moved way beyond Durkheim, Weber, and Marx, even while still arguing with their ghosts. I want to zero in on a much newer theory mentioned in the text that really made me raise an eyebrow, this concept of rational choice theory, or RCT.
Ah, yes. The application of free market economic principles to religious behavior. It has been an incredibly hot topic and highly controversial.
Controversial is an understatement. I have to push back aggressively on this. Are we really supposed to view religion like a spiritual supermarket?
Yeah.
Under RCT, believers are just framed as rational consumers weighing the cost benefits of a faith. Like, well, the Methodist Church has a better youth program and nicer parking, but the Baptist Church down the road offers a more robust afterlife insurance policy and lower tithing requirements, so I'll maximize my utility and go with them. It just feels like a hyper-capitalist, exceptionally American way of looking at the human soul. It's wildly reductive.
What's fascinating here is that the handbook actually shares your outrage. It offers a very strong critique of rational choice theory, articulated beautifully in a chapter by Malcolm Hamilton.
Oh, thank goodness, because I was ready to throw the book across the room.
Hamilton's critique is exactly what you just pointed out. RCT attempts to reduce homo religiosus, the religious human, entirely into homo economicus, the economic human. It operates on the assumption that we are all just rational actors constantly calculating costs and rewards to maximize personal utility.
But religion is so rarely a simple product you consume.
No, not at all. It is tied to deep ancestral identity, profound existential meaning, generational trauma, emotional attachment, complex social embeddedness. You don't just shop for a new faith the way you shop for car insurance.
So why do sociologists use it at all if it's that flawed? Why is it even in the handbook?
Because, as Hamilton suggests, drawing on the work of James Pickard RCT shouldn't be discarded entirely. It just needs to be demoted from a grand theory of human belief to a localized heuristic device.
Like a tool for a specific job.
Exactly. It is actually quite useful for understanding religious provision and consumption on a macro level, particularly in environments like the United States, where there's a highly competitive, deregulated religious market with no state monopoly on faith.
I see. So if a megachurch wants to survive in a town with 20 other churches, the pastors absolutely have to think about what they're offering compared to the church down the street. They have to think about parking, music quality, and childcare.
Right. The institutions themselves often operate as rational actors competing for market share. RCT is great for mapping that institutional behavior. The mistake is thinking that this supply and demand dynamic explains the internal subjective mysteries of why an individual actually believes in God.
Okay, so if religion isn't just an illusion masking class struggle like Marx thought, and it isn't just a simple cost-benefit analysis at the spiritual grocery store like RCT claims, what actually is it?
This is where the handbook introduces some heavy-hitting modern theorists to give us a much more nuanced, organic picture. Thinkers like Michel Foucault, Pierre Bourdieu, and Jürgen Habermas.
Let's take them one by one. Foucault is famous for his work on power dynamics. How does he fit into religion?
Well, while Foucault didn't write a sociology of religion per se, his concepts are heavily utilized by modern sociologists. For Foucault, religion isn't just a set of abstract beliefs you hold in your mind. It is intricately tied to power and discourses of truth. He views religion as operating through technologies of the self.
What does that actually mean in practice?
It means power isn't just exercised from the top down, like a king threatening you with a sword. Power is exercised through our own bodies and our daily self-managed routines.
Oh, wow.
Think about how religions regulate diet through fasting or halal and kosher laws. Think about how they regulate sexuality, clothing, and daily prayer schedules. That is power operating at the absolute micro level. The believer polices their own body and mind, shaping themselves into a specific type of religious subject.
It's not just the Pope making a decree, it's the individual internalizing that decree in how they chew their food and when they wake up.
Yes, exactly.
That makes total sense. It's power woven into the fabric of daily existence, which segues perfectly into Pierre Bourdieu.
Yes. Inger Forseth's chapter highlights Bourdieu, who introduces the concept of the habitus. The habitus refers to the deeply ingrained habits, skills, and physical dispositions we possess due to our life experiences. For Bourdieu, religion is fundamentally embodied.
It reminds me of learning to drive a manual transmission car.
Okay, how so?
Well, at first you have to think about the clutch, the gas, the shifter, but eventually your body just knows how to do it. It becomes muscle memory.
That is a perfect analogy. Religion is muscle memory for the soul. It's not just something you intellectually assent to, it's something you do with your physical form. The specific way you kneel on a prayer rug, the way you bow your head, the physical sensation of fasting for Ramadan or giving up meat for Lent.
These actions aren't just outward expressions of an internal belief.
Right. The physical actions themselves continually construct and reinforce the belief. The religion lives in the posture of the body as much as in the mind.
And what about Habermas? Where does he fit into this?
Habermas is deeply concerned with the public sphere, the arena where citizens gather to debate and form public opinion. For a long time, Western sociology assumed that as societies modernized and became more scientific, religion would eventually be relegated entirely to the private sphere.
You could believe whatever you wanted at home, but public life would be strictly secular.
But we know that hasn't happened. Religion is incredibly loud in the public square.
Sing dream loud.
Exactly. Habermas recognizes that religion is stubbornly, persistently public. So his work explores how religious and secular citizens can actually communicate in a pluralistic democracy. He's interested in the translation process.
Translation.
Yeah, can religious arguments be translated into accessible, secular language in the public sphere so that actual democratic debate can happen? Because if one side says we must do this because it's human rights and the other says we must do this because God commands it, they are just shouting past each other.
So if we pull all these foundational threads together, if religion isn't just a simple cost-benefit analysis, but rather this incredibly complex web of social power, embodied physical practice, evolutionary group bonding, and public democratic debate, how do sociologists even begin to measure it or define it?
That's tough.
Because it sounds like trying to nail jelly to a wall,
Mm-hmm.
especially if we want to avoid just projecting our own cultural biases onto the rest of the world.
That structural dilemma is the perfect transition into the next major theme of our deep dive: method and definitions. Because before you can scientifically study something, you had to define the parameters of what it is you are looking at. And as Andrei Drugers outlines in his chapter, defining religion is notoriously, almost comically difficult.
The Handbook uses this amazing classic Indian parable to describe this struggle. The blind man and the elephant.
It's a very apt metaphor. A group of blind men encounter an elephant for the first time. One touches the trunk and says, "Ah, an elephant is like a thick snake." Another touches the leg and says, "No, an elephant is like a sturdy tree trunk." Another touches the tusk and says, "You're both wrong. It's smooth and sharp like a spear."
And the point is, they are all factually correct about the specific part they are touching, but they are all completely wrong about the nature of the animal because they are missing the whole picture.
Exactly. And Drugers points out that academic disciplines act exactly like those blind men. A psychologist looks at religion and sees individual cognitive coping mechanisms and attachment styles. A sociologist looks at the same religion and sees group cohesion and boundary maintenance.
An anthropologist sees cultural symbols and mythic narratives.
Right, and an economist sees rational choice and resource allocation. They're all touching a different part of the elephant.
So how do we step back and see the whole elephant? How do we establish a working definition that doesn't just reduce religion to one single function?
Drugers suggests we have to break the act of defining religion down into three distinct dimensions: the ontological, the epistemological, and the methodological.
Okay, let's unpack those because they sound incredibly dense. Ontological first. Ontology is the study of the nature of being, right? So this is asking, what is the fundamental nature of religion?
Right. What are the strict parameters for deciding what counts as a religion and what doesn't? If you say religion requires a belief in a transcendent creator God, well, you've just excluded massive branches of Buddhism and Taoism.
Right.
You say religion is essentially a moral code for living a good life. Well, secular humanism has that, so is secular humanism a religion? This is the hardest dimension because you are trying to find a universal essence that applies globally across vastly different cultures.
And then there's the epistemological dimension. Epistemology is how we know what we know.
This dimension deals with the observer's relationship to the phenomenon. It's the tricky question of distance versus closeness, objectivity versus subjectivity. Can you truly deeply understand a religion if you are an outsider looking in, completely devoid of the emotional experience of the faith?
That makes sense.
But conversely, can you be scientifically objective if you are a devout insider who believes the texts are literal, infallible truths?
That dynamic brings up a point in the text that I found incredibly vital and frankly long overdue. The feminist and gender-critical critique of how Western academics have historically studied religion. See, and Hawthorne's chapter really hammers this home.
It's a crucial intervention in the handbook. Walk me through the critique that stood out to you.
Well, Hawthorne argues that historically, scholars of religion became obsessed with finding the authentic insider perspective. They wanted to go to a foreign culture and find the one true voice that could explain their religion to them. But by doing that, these scholars, who were mostly Western men, almost exclusively sought out male, elite institutional leaders as the only true representatives of a faith.
All right, they ignored the lived religion of women, the poor, and the marginalized.
Yes, the academic lens artificially elevated the institutional over the organic.
And furthermore, she points out that this whole objective outsider studying the authentic insider dynamic actively masked a colonialist legacy.
Exactly.
How so? Expand on that dynamic for the listener.
Okay, so by naming themselves as rational, objective outsiders who were simply observing the worldviews of religious practitioners, Western scholars could completely avoid confronting their own complicity in global power dynamics. They treated the non-Western practitioner simply as a specimen, the other to be categorized and filed away in an archive.
It was a subtle way of absolutizing Western rationalism as the default human state.
Right, while pretending to just be neutrally studying Eastern mysticism or indigenous practices. The quest for the insider became just a polite academic mechanism for controlling and defining the other.
That is a profound critique. It forces us to realize that the epistemological stance of the researcher is never politically neutral. It is always embedded in historical power relations. Which brings us to the third dimension, the methodological. Once you navigate the politics of knowing, how do you actually technically study the elephant? What tools do we use? Are we running statistical surveys? Are we doing deep ethnographic interviews? The text highlights the work of Ninian Smart, who proposed a multi-dimensional approach as a potential solution to this whole elephant problem. Rather than agonizing over finding one single, perfect, defining essence of religion, Smart suggested we need to look at religion as a complex phenomenon that operates across 7 dimensions simultaneously.
Let's run through those 7, because if you apply these to any faith, it really forces you to see the whole picture. You have the ritual or practical dimension, what people actually do, the doctrinal or philosophical dimension, what they formally believe.
The mythic or narrative dimension, the stories they tell.
Right, the experiential or emotional dimension, what they feel, the ethical or legal dimension, the rules they follow, the organizational or social dimension, how they structure their communities. And finally, the material or artistic dimension, the physical objects and buildings they create.
Exactly. If you look at a phenomenon through all 7 of those lenses, the elephant comes into focus. You aren't just reading their theology textbook, you are observing their architecture, listening to their music, analyzing their hierarchy, and watching their bodies during a ritual. It captures the truly organic nature of the thing.
But here is the inevitable catch. Even with a brilliant multidimensional tool like Ninian Smart's, once we finally establish a working, complex definition of religion, we inevitably run into the edges of that definition.
The boundaries. Where exactly does religion stop and other domains of human experience begin?
I want to start with the boundary between religion and morality, because for a massive portion of the population, those two concepts are identical. They get their moral compass entirely from their religious text.
And historically, those two domains were deeply, almost inextricably intertwined. But the Handbook, particularly in John Reeder's chapter, discusses the critical decoupling of morality from religion in modern differentiated society.
Meaning the realization that you don't need a fear of God to be a good neighbor.
Precisely. Reeder suggests we can conceptually distinguish them by looking at their primary focus. Morality is fundamentally concerned with horizontal interhuman issues. It asks questions about how we treat each other. What is justice? What is fairness? What is harm?
Okay.
Religion, while it absolutely includes and informs morality, fixes its ultimate attention on a different axis. It is concerned with the fundamental causes of well-being and suffering, the ultimate nature of reality, and the cosmos.
So morality is horizontal person to person. Religion is vertical person to the cosmos or person to the transcendent.
That's an excellent way to visualize it. And this decoupling of the horizontal from the vertical leads us to one of the most fascinating and, frankly, highly understudied areas in the sociology of religion, the study of atheism.
Yes. William Sims Bainbridge wrote a whole chapter on this. On the surface, it seems totally counterintuitive to study the absence of religion in a massive textbook dedicated to the sociology of religion.
But, as Bainbridge astutely points out, you cannot fully understand the shape of faith without taking account of its absence. We can't fully understand the historical trajectory of religion without imagining its disappearance. Atheists, agnostics, and the non-affiliated represent a massive, globally relevant demographic.
But how does a sociologist study atheism? It's not like atheists gather in a specific building on Sunday mornings to sing songs about how much they don't believe in God. There aren't many atheist rituals to observe.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture and go back to our friend Emil Durkheim for a moment,
Mm.
remember his foundational idea that religion is fundamentally an expression of society, that worshiping the sacred is essentially a disguised way of worshiping the social group.
Yeah, religion is the glue of social identity.
View atheism through that strict Durkheimian lens. Historically, in highly religious societies, if you publicly refused to participate in the religion, you weren't just making a theological argument about a lack of empirical evidence for a creator. You were actively refusing to submit to society's demands. You were rejecting the shared symbolic markers of the tribe.
So sociologists historically conceptualized atheism not just as an intellectual or philosophical stance, but as a form of profound social estrangement. It was categorized as deviance.
Exactly. Not deviance in a necessarily pejorative or criminal sense, but in the strict sociological sense of deviating from the normative, sacred social bonds that hold the collective group together. The village atheist in 18th century Europe was a social pariah because they threatened the Durkheimian glue.
That is fascinating. It's a positioning of the self entirely outside the traditional sacred canopy of the group. Though I imagine that dynamic has changed wildly depending on where you live today.
Oh, absolutely. As societies undergo secularization, the boundary shifts. Being an atheist in modern-day Copenhagen or Seattle is entirely normative. It carries zero social deviance. But in other parts of the world, it remains highly stigmatized. The boundary between religion and irreligion is highly fluid and entirely socially constructed.
Speaking of fluid boundaries, I want to ask you about the extreme edges of human experience mentioned in the text. Things like art, and specifically phenomena like trance and spirit possession. Iowan M. Lewis covers this in his chapter.
Yes, the social roots of ecstasy, trance, and possession.
We see this across the globe. Altered states of consciousness, whether it's speaking in tongues in a Pentecostal church or spirit possession in an indigenous shamanic ritual. Are these events just biological misfires, a temporary short circuit in the brain's temporal lobe, or are they profound sociological boundary markers? Because Lewis mentions that these states overlap heavily with both religious and sexual experience.
The sociological view is that we cannot dismiss these altered states as mere random biological misfires. While there is a physiological component, sociologically they are deeply meaningful, highly structured social events. They are culturally choreographed.
Interesting.
Lewis explores how altered states of consciousness, which are externalized in behavior through trance, serve very specific functions. Often they act as ways for individuals, particularly women and marginalized individuals in heavily patriarchal societies, to access power, voice grievances, or express forbidden desires under the socially sanctioned protective umbrella of "the spirits made me do it."
Oh, so it's a culturally approved pressure valve for the society.
In many ways, yes. It's a boundary zone where the conscious, restricted self temporarily ends and the transcendent or the social collective takes over. It embodies the religion in the most visceral, physical way possible, allowing society to process tensions that cannot be expressed in normal waking discourse.
Okay, so the boundaries between religion and morality, or religion and consciousness, are largely philosophical and psychological. But the boundaries of religion become violently real, physically tangible, when they intersect with the hard borders of the state and the law.
Which brings us to the next massive theme in the handbook: religion, the state, the nation, and the law.
Let's start by exploding a very popular myth, the myth of the complete and total separation of church and state.
It is a myth, at least in any absolute pure sense. The text makes it very clear that even in modern, proudly secular democracies, the state actively regulates, defines, and manages religion on a daily basis.
But how? Because in the U.S., for example, we literally have the First Amendment explicitly stating that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. It's supposed to be an impenetrable wall.
True, but the state still has to legally define what counts as a religion in the first place, largely for tax exemption purposes and zoning laws. The state has to decide if a new religious group is a legitimate expression of faith deserving of constitutional protection or a dangerous cult that requires criminal investigation.
Right.
J.S.T. Richardson's chapter notes that the state typically manages religion in two main modes, either in a paternalistic consumer protection mode, intervening to ensure groups don't financially exploit or physically abuse their members, or through a strict control mode, where the state heavily limits religious expressions that it deems a threat to public order or national security. The state is always watching.
And the text dives into some incredibly sensitive areas here regarding the deep conflict between state law and religious law.
Mhm.
Now, just as a quick disclaimer to you, the listener, sociology isn't here to tell us which side is theologically or politically right or wrong in these modern culture wars.
Absolutely not. We're staying strictly impartial here.
Right. It just holds up a mirror to show us that when a secular state law clashes with a religious tradition, we are actually watching two different sets of sacred values collide.
Exactly. Enzo Pace's chapter on human rights highlights this collision brilliantly.
Mm.
He examines situations where universal human rights frameworks, embedded in state or international law, clash directly with religious doctrine.
Give me some examples from the text.
He points to ongoing conflicts within Catholicism regarding the ordination of women. He highlights tensions in Hinduism regarding traditional caste issues and the egalitarian rights of lower castes.
Mm.
And he discusses the complex debates in various nations over the application of Islamic law, particularly concerning family law, inheritance, and the rights of women.
And again, we are not taking a stance on these. But in all of these cases, you have individuals or groups utilizing the legal language of universal human rights, claiming gender equality or freedom from discrimination, while the religious institution is claiming adherence to divine will, sacred text, or ancient tradition. It's an intractable conflict.
And this is where Pace asks a truly brilliant sociological question. How should we view human rights themselves from a sociological perspective?
I wanted to bring this up because when you read the foundational documents of human rights, the language sounds incredibly, I don't know, religious. We hold these truths to be self-evident. It sounds like a doctrinal creed.
That is precisely Pace's argument. He argues that human rights function as a modern generative grammar of global society. In an increasingly complex, pluralistic, secular world, society still desperately needs to believe in a nucleus of shared universal values to hold itself together and prevent chaos. Human rights have essentially become a set of untouchable sacred values.
So human rights operate sociologically exactly like a religion.
Sociologically speaking, yes. They provide a transcendent ethical framework that sits above the laws of any single nation. So when state law based on human rights clashes with traditional religious law, it's not just a battle of secularism versus religion. It's often a clash between two competing systems of the sacred.
Wow. That completely reframes the narrative. It's not a lack of faith in the modern world. It's a collision of deeply held faiths. And these legal, national, and religious boundaries are currently being tested and strained like never before. Why? Because of the unprecedented massive movement of people around the globe.
This takes us into the realities of globalization, migration, and religious diversity.
Let's talk about globalization. The Handbook makes it clear that globalization has effectively ended religious regionalism.
It used to be that geography dictated your religion with near absolute certainty. If you were born in India, you were likely Hindu. If you were born in Europe, you're Christian. If you were born in the Middle East, you were Muslim.
Right.
But mass economic migration, cheap air travel, and global digital communication have shattered that geographical monopoly. The editor, Peter Clark, notes that it now makes total sociological sense to speak of European Islam or American Buddhism. The old territorial borders of faith are gone.
The religious map isn't a map of solid-colored blocks anymore. It's a kaleidoscope. And this rapid migration is creating incredibly diverse religious landscapes, particularly in major urban centers around the world.
Which brings up a major anxiety that plagued early sociologists. Thinkers like Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman in the 1960s worried deeply that this kind of radical religious diversity would inherently undermine social cohesion.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they operated on the idea that a society required a single, overarching, sacred canopy of shared meaning to hold together. Their fear was that if you have multiple competing truth claims in the same city, the canopy inevitably fractures and society falls into enemy and conflict.
Right. The logic is, if everyone believes fundamentally different things about the nature of reality, how do we agree on anything at a civic level? But here's where it gets really interesting. The Handbook argues that this zero-sum assumption of mid-20th century sociologists was entirely wrong.
Yes, Gary D. Bouma and Rodling's chapter dismantles that old fear beautifully. They argue that social and religious reality in a globalized world is much better understood through the metaphor of a biospace.
A biospace.
Yes, in a biological ecosystem, diversity isn't a threat. Diversity is expected and is absolutely essential to the health and resilience of the system. Change and adaptation are endemic to living.
So religious diversity doesn't inherently break society?
No. In fact, contestation for resources, space, and meaning is just the normal order of the day. A religiously diverse society can actually be highly cohesive, precisely because the ongoing negotiation of difference creates a dynamic, adaptable, resilient social fabric. It's not a zero-sum game where more diversity automatically equals less social cohesion.
But we have to acknowledge that not everyone is happy about this diversity or this biospace, which brings us to the inevitable backlash.
Yes, the rise of religious fundamentalism across the globe. Anton Shoup covers this phenomenon in depth.
How does sociology explain fundamentalism? Because the popular media narrative is often that it's just people being stuck in the past, ignorantly refusing to modernize.
Sociologically, that narrative is entirely false. Fundamentalism is a distinctly, uniquely modern phenomenon. It is a direct, calculated backlash against the squishiness of postmodern forms of belief. Right.
Squishiness.
In a highly globalized world where everything is relativized, where you are constantly told that all religions are just different paths up the exact same mountain,
Yeah.
or that truth is subjective and personal fundamentalists draw a hard line. They say, no, there is objective, absolute truth, and we possess it.
It's an attempt to reclaim absolute certainty in a world suffering from a dizzying excess of choices.
Exactly. It is not a blind retreat into the past. It's an aggressive, strategic engagement with the present. Fundamentalist movements often utilize highly modern tools like sophisticated internet broadcasting, global financial networks, and modern political mobilization to assert a non-negotiable, sacred truth against the tide of postmodern relativism.
So, with this massive global reshuffling, this complex biospace of diversity, and the fierce fundamentalist backlash, how are individuals actually organizing themselves on the ground to survive all these changes?
That brings us to the mechanics of religious collectivities and the clergy. How do people actually gather and lead in this new landscape?
The Handbook breaks down the classical typology of religious organizations: church, sect, and cult. Let's define these clearly, because people use these words very casually in everyday conversation, but they have very specific technical meanings in sociology.
Right. This specific typology traces its roots back to Max Weber and Ernst Troeltsch, and was later refined by other scholars. In sociological terms, a church is a religious organization that is highly integrated into the larger society. It largely accepts the secular social order, it's highly bureaucratized, it has professional clergy, and crucially, membership is often born into rather than joined voluntarily. Think of the Church of England or the Catholic Church in medieval Europe.
Okay, and a sect.
A sect is typically a group that is broken away from a mainstream church. They usually break away in an attempt to renew or return to what they see as the original, uncorrupted purity of the faith. They exist in a state of much higher tension with the surrounding society than a church does.
They demand strict, high-cost commitment from their members.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But they still fundamentally share the same basic cultural and theological heritage as the mainstream group they left.
And then there's the C word, cult. I have to push back on the use of this word in an academic textbook. Is cult just a pejorative slur we throw at weird religions we don't like, or does it retain actual sociological value?
It is a highly controversial, heavily debated term, and your pushback is completely warranted. In the media and popular culture, it is absolutely used as a slur to delegitimize a group. But sociologically, as Lauren L. Dawson explains in his chapter, it originally had a very specific neutral meaning. A religious group that is in high tension with society and represents a significant theological innovation.
Oh, interesting.
It's not a breakaway group trying to return to old purity like a sect. It's something entirely new or something imported from a radically different culture.
So, under that strict definition, early Christianity operating within the Roman Empire would have been viewed sociologically as a cult.
Precisely, or a new UFO religion emerging today. However, Dawson and the text issue a very strong warning. Scholars are increasingly reluctant to use this church-sect-cult framework, especially cross-culturally. It was a tool built specifically to explain European Christian history.
Ah, I see.
If you try applying it to Hinduism or to Islam, as Semi Zubaida notes regarding the complexities of sects in the Islamic world, it often distorts the reality on the ground more than it reveals it.
Got it. Now, what about the people actually leading these groups, the clergy?
Dinar Hogi writes an illuminating chapter on the sociology of the clergy, and the overarching theme across the board is a profound crisis of authority.
Is that crisis primarily because of the endless wave of institutional scandals we read about?
Scandals play a significant role, certainly, as they shatter institutional trust. But the sociological shift is much deeper than scandal. It is rooted in the declining authority of traditional religious professionals in a highly educated, highly differentiated society.
Right.
Historically, the clergy were often the most educated people in a town. Today, that isn't the case. People are far less likely to just blindly take a priest, a rabbi, or an imam's word on complex issues of morality, science, or politics. There's been a massive shift toward more egalitarian relations between the clergy and the laity.
Modern believers want to do their own research. They want to be the arbiters of their own spiritual journey, and they view the clergy more as consultants than absolute authorities.
Yes, and Hoji points out an urgent, glaring sociological need here. We have studied the white, male, mainline Christian clergy to the point of exhaustion. What we desperately need to study are marginalized clergy. We need robust data on women clergy navigating patriarchal structures, homosexual clergy, and non-Western leaders who are now operating in entirely new cultural contexts, like imams leading mosques in London or Buddhist priests establishing centers in California. How are they navigating and establishing authority in a broader culture that doesn't inherently grant it to them, or within traditions that are undergoing massive, painful internal debates about their roles?
That feels like a huge gap in the research that needs filling. Okay, so if the traditional clergy is losing its monopoly on authority and sects are fragmenting, and we have this tension between global diversity and fundamentalist backlash, does this mean religion as we know it is simply dying out? Which brings us to the most fiercely debated topic in the entire field, the secularization thesis.
Ah, yes, the big one, the debate that never truly ends.
Is the world getting less religious? Is faith disappearing?
The sociological answer is, well, it is highly complicated. Carol Daubelair unpacks the secularization thesis in his chapter. He explains that secularization isn't just a single master switch that a society flips from religion on to religion off. It's not a straight line to atheism. Instead, secularization operates simultaneously on three distinct levels: the macro, the meso, and the micro.
We need robust examples for these. Break down the macro level first.
The macro level is societal and institutional. This is where secularization is undeniably, demonstrably happening, particularly in the West. It refers to religion losing its power to dictate and regulate the so-called secular subsystems of society: the state, the economy, science, and the law.
Okay.
Think about it historically. The church used to run the hospitals, the universities, and the social welfare systems as a near monopoly. Today, the state or the private sector runs them based on secular, rational principles, not theological ones.
Okay, that makes sense. Religion has lost the macro level control of society. What's the meso level?
Meso is the organizational level. This refers to the power and influence of the religious institutions themselves. We see secularization here through dropping attendance rates, the closing and selling off of physical church buildings, and the declining social and political influence of specific mainstream denominations. The organizations themselves are shrinking in many parts of the world.
And the micro level?
The micro level is the individual level. Are individual human beings actually less religious? This is where the sociological debate is fiercest. Because while macro and meso-secularization are highly evident in places like Europe, individual micro-level belief often remains incredibly high.
Wait, really?
Yeah, people might completely stop going to church, but they still pray daily, they still believe in a higher power or an afterlife, and they still identify as deeply spiritual.
Grace Davy famously called this believing without belonging.
Exactly. So secularization isn't necessarily the death of faith. It is a profound transformation of how religion operates and where it is located. It has moved from the center of the public square to the private heart of the individual.
And a massive part of that transformation involves how religion actually gets passed down to the next generation. If the church is shrinking, how does faith survive? Penny Edgell has a fascinating chapter on religion and the family. I loved her conceptualization of the family as the factory for religious transmission.
It's a crucial sociological concept.
Yeah.
The family is the primary essential site where religious values are reproduced and internalized. Historically, religious institutions in the traditional patriarchal nuclear family were institutionally interdependent.
Right.
The church produced a culture that supported the nuclear family, and the nuclear family dutifully produced children to fill the church pews. They fed each other.
But family forms in the modern world have diversified massively. We have single parents, blended families, same-sex parents, cohabiting couples who choose not to marry.
And many traditional religious institutions are struggling profoundly to adapt to this. As family forms diversify, the traditional factory of religious transmission often breaks down for those who don't fit the rigid, idealized mold. The programming, the language, and the daily practices of many congregations make it very easy for traditional families to participate, but inadvertently alienate or marginalize others.
So if the traditional nuclear family and the traditional church are both changing, how does religious identity actually reproduce itself today?
Matthew Guest introduces a concept borrowed from Pierre Bourdieu that is incredibly helpful here: spiritual capital. Instead of looking at strict, top-down, institutional, control-like, mandatory Sunday school attendance or confirmation classes, we should look at how religious identity is mobilized as a personal resource.
Spiritual capital.
Yes, spiritual capital is about the networks you build, the shared values you curate, and the empowerment of the individual spiritual seeker. It is acquired, developed, and transmitted in much more fluid, personalized ways now.
And nothing empowers the individual spiritual seeker to build their own networks quite like the internet.
Stuart M. Hoover and Gary R. Bunt discuss the profound impact of the media, and specifically the internet, on religion. The internet has acted as a massive accelerant for the democratization and the de-objectification of religious knowledge.
De-objectification. Unpack that term for me.
It means that the sacred knowledge is no longer treated as an objective object locked inside a physical building guarded by an ordained expert. You no longer have to go to the church and ask the priest to interpret the ancient text for you.
You can just Google it.
Exactly. You can go online, find a global forum of like-minded seekers, read 20 diverse translations of the text yourself, and construct your own highly personalized theology. The center of religious authority has violently shifted away from the formal institution and toward the individual network.
Because the internet and modern consumer culture allow people to completely bypass the traditional church hierarchy, we are seeing an absolute explosion of entirely new, organic ways to be religious. Which brings us to the next massive shift: religious change, new spiritualities, and implicit religion.
Let's start with NRM's new religious movements. Historically, sociologists have been obsessed with studying them.
Why do they care so much about them? NRMs often seem statistically marginal compared to the major world religions.
Because, as David G. Bromley explains, NRMs act as incredibly valuable real-time sociological laboratories.
In what way?
Think about it. It is incredibly difficult to sociologically study the origins of Christianity or Buddhism because they started millennia ago in vastly different, poorly documented social contexts. We only have fragments. But with a new religious movement, sociologists can actually watch the social construction of a religion happen in real time. We can observe exactly how a charismatic leader gains initial followers. We can watch how abstract ideas are codified into strict doctrines. We can see how the group handles the inevitable crisis of succession when the founder dies, and we can study exactly how the mainstream society reacts to and often persecutes them. They provide a transparent window into the actual birth of human faith.
That makes a lot of sense. But the bigger demographic story in the West isn't people leaving mainstream churches to join NRMs. The bigger story is people leaving mainstream churches to join nothing at all. The rise of unchurched spirituality and spiritualities of life.
Yes, Paul Heelas and Eva M. Hamburg write extensively about this massive growing demographic of people who identify as spiritual but not religious. These are individuals who actively reject formal church congregations, dogmas, and hierarchies, but who heavily engage in practices aimed at cultivating the inner self: meditation, yoga, tarot, crystal healing, or holistic wellness. Heelas even suggests that the entire discipline might need to be renamed the Sociology of Religion and Spirituality to capture this shift.
It's a massive cultural shift from religion viewed as a public civic duty to spirituality viewed as a highly private path for personal well-being and authenticity.
And this raises an important question, perhaps the most provocative, mind-bending question in the entire handbook, introduced by Edward Bailey: the concept of implicit religion.
This concept completely blew my mind, and it loops perfectly back to the hook we started this deep dive with.
It forces us to ask, what truly defines a religion? Is it strictly the belief in a supernatural, transcendent God? Bailey argues that if we look closely at the actual sociological functions of religion meaning-making, group solidarity, ritualistic behavior, deep existential commitment, and the designation of sacred time and space, we find those exact functions everywhere in completely secular society.
So let's linger on this. Can a deep generational commitment to a sports franchise function sociologically as a religion?
Absolutely. Think about the mechanics. You have the rituals, The tailgating, wearing the specific colors, chanting the specific songs at the exact right moment. You have the sacred space of the stadium, which has its own rules of behavior. You have the shared, intense emotional highs of a championship and the devastating lows of a loss. You have the profound, visceral feeling of belonging to an us that is situated against a them.
Or secular humanism, or extreme, organized devotion to a pop star.
Can we view Swifties or the Bayhive as implicit religious movements?
Sociologically speaking, the group solidarities, the pilgrimages to concerts, the deciphering of sacred texts, in this case lyrics, and the profound meaning-making processes perfectly mirror traditional religion. People are actively finding their sacred, their ultimate concern, outside the walls of the church. If religion is fundamentally about what you hold as ultimately important, what binds you to others, then implicit religion is everywhere. Okay, so whether it's an implicit religion, like an intense fandom, a highly personalized new spirituality, or a traditional ancient faith. These belief systems don't just exist as abstract ideas in our heads. They interact directly with our physical bodies, our communities, and our society's greatest crises.
That brings us to our final substantive area of exploration: religion's impact on ecology, health, social issues, and violence.
Let's look at health first. Wendy Cadge's chapter points out a really interesting shift in how sociologists are currently studying the intersection of health and religion.
Yes. For a very long time, the sociological and medical research was heavily focused on the individual level. Does praying make you recover from open-heart surgery faster? Does attending church regularly lower your blood pressure and increase your lifespan?
And the results of those studies were always kind of mixed or hard to definitively prove.
Right, because controlling variables is nearly impossible. So Cadge argues for a shift toward an institutional approach. Instead of just looking at the individual patient's prayer life, sociologists are now looking at how massive hospitals, as highly rationalized biomedical organizations, integrate spirituality into their systems.
Ah, I see.
How do hospital chaplains function in a setting driven entirely by science and efficiency? How do medical professionals negotiate their own personal religious ethics when dealing with complex, modern, bioethical issues like end-of-life care or genetic testing? It's bringing the macro organizational level back into focus.
The text also delves heavily into the social impact of religion regarding crime and altruism.
Byron R. Johnson looks at the data regarding religion as a protective factor against delinquency. The research generally shows that robust religious involvement fosters pro-social behavior and statistically reduces participation in crime. Similarly, Kishan Inaba and Kate Lowenthal explore how religion promotes altruism, volunteering, and massive charitable giving networks.
But there is a massive but here.
But this pro-social altruistic function is immediately and starkly contrasted with the dark side of the sacred, religious violence.
Mark Juergensmeyer and Michael Kirwan tackled this incredibly heavy topic. And just to remind you, the listener, sociology isn't here to judge the theology of these acts. It's here to ask why religion, which preaches peace, so easily lends itself to extreme violence. We go back to Marx and Weber here.
We do. For a Marxist sociologist, religious violence like a sectarian civil war would largely be analyzed as mass class conflict. The religious language is just a veneer for a battle over material resources. For a Weberian sociologist, religious violence is about the inevitable clash of ultimate irreconcilable values.
But Kirwan introduces an entirely different framework. René Girard's concept of mimetic violence. I want to explore this deeply because it is chillingly insightful. What is mimetic violence?
Girard theorized that human desire is fundamentally mimetic, meaning we don't know what we want independently, we want what others want, we imitate the desires of our neighbors. This inevitable imitation leads to intense rivalry over the same objects, status, or resources.
Right.
Rivalry inevitably escalates into conflict, and conflict threatens to destroy the entire community in a cycle of endless retaliation.
Wait, so how does a society stop itself from burning to the ground in that cycle?
Girard argued that to stop the cycle of violence, society unconsciously utilizes a mechanism. It singles out a scapegoat. A marginalized individual or group is blamed for the crisis. The community unifies against the scapegoat. The scapegoat is violently sacrificed or expelled, the internal tension is purged, and a temporary magical peace is restored to the community.
And religion is the mechanism that facilitates this.
Girard argued that archaic religions were essentially built around managing the scapegoat mechanism through highly ritualized sacrifice. But he also argued that the core Judeo-Christian narrative, the crucifixion, actually exposes the innocence of the scapegoat, which conceptually disrupts the cycle. However, in the modern world, we still see the profound, terrifying dynamics of martyrdom, cosmic war, and scapegoating playing out in religious terrorism.
Again, keeping our neutral stance,
It's a deeply troubling, highly complex social phenomenon where the sacred is weaponized to unify a group through the destruction of an other.
it's incredibly heavy, and it shows the sheer power of what we are dealing with all of this immense complexity, from evolutionary biology and global migration to implicit religion, spiritual capital, and the mechanics of sacred violence. How does one even begin to teach this subject to the next generation?
This brings us to the conclusion of the Handbook, where Eleanor Nesbitt discusses teaching the sociology of religion. She argues that to understand religion today, the student, the teacher, and frankly, the everyday citizen must become ethnographers.
Meaning they have to get out of the textbook, get out of the theoretical clouds, and get down into the messy field.
Exactly. You cannot just memorize doctrines or memorize the dates of church councils. You have to observe lived, embodied religion. You have to see the organic, boundary-crossing reality of how people actually practice their faith in the messy context of their daily lives. You have to talk to them, observe their physical rituals, understand their Bordeauxan habitus, and see how they navigate the modern biospace.
So let's provide a grand summary of this massive source material. If there's one overarching, undeniable theme we've learned from the Oxford Handbook of the Sociology of Religion, it's that we can no longer view religion as a static, dying Western institution.
The old secularization thesis, in its simplest, most triumphant form, which confidently predicted the inevitable total demise of human faith in the face of science, is dead. Religion is not vanishing. It is not a relic of the past.
Instead, it is a highly vibrant, completely organic, global phenomenon that constantly morphs and adapts. It appears in traditional mosques, temples, and churches, yes, but it also appears in decentralized internet forums, in secular legal battles over universal human rights, in private, unchurched spiritualities, and even in the roaring crowds of football stadiums.
It is the ultimate sociological shapeshifter. It is continually adapting to globalization, mass migration, and the digital age. We are living in a biospace of constant negotiation of the sacred.
Which leaves me and you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over. We've spent this time talking about the definition of religion expanding to include implicit religions. We've seen how traditional faiths are decentralizing via the internet and shifting into fluid spiritual capital.
The old boundaries of the sacred and the profane are entirely blurred.
So, here's the question. Is it possible that society isn't actually secularizing at all? What if we aren't losing our religion? What if we are currently living in the most deeply, intensely religious era in all of human history, but we simply haven't recognized the new gods we are worshiping?
Now that is a diagnostic, muddy water worth exploring.
We'll leave you to think about that. Thanks for diving deep with us.